This is the Jepson Parkway Project Phase 2A Biological Resources Information Program. Alluvion Biological Consulting Environmental Education Series, Volume 24. Okay, so let's get started. Now each of you should have your own copy of the Biological Resources Information Program for the Jepson Phase 2A project. And if you don't have your own copy, you should be sharing it with someone. So let's go through a general overview of the items we'll be talking about today as we go through the program. Regulatory oversight and resource protection for the project, definition of take and penalties, what to do if you see a regulated species, who can handle, touch, or remove a regulated species, species known to occur or potentially occurring in the project area, the protective radius for regulated species, the biological management area and what that means for you, general mitigation measures, environmentally sensitive areas, Stormwater Pollution Prevention Program, or SWIP, and invasive and noxious weeds. Regulatory oversight and protection. The California Department of Transportation complies with federal and state laws and regulations and acts as a good steward of natural lands under its control. The City of Fairfield, California, is also required to comply with federal and state environmental laws and regulations in all phases of project development, planning, permitting, construction, and/or maintenance. As such, the City of Fairfield has identified existing sensitive biological resources and evaluated the potential adverse effects during project development and implementation, and work with state and federal agencies to develop a plan to mitigate the effects of these project actions. The conditions of those plans are what we will be going over today. The definition of take and associated penalties. There are two definitions of take, a federal definition and a state definition. This is important, so please follow along in your manuals. Under the Federal Endangered Species Act, the term take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or to attempt to engage in any such conduct. Harm is defined as an act which actually kills or injures wildlife. Such acts may include significant habitat modification or degradation when it actually kills or injures wildlife by significantly impairing essential behavioral patterns, including breeding, feeding, or sheltering. Under the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the term take is defined as hunt, pursue, catch, capture, or kill, or to attempt to do such actions. The consequences of unsanctioned take, i.e. unpermitted take, could be criminal penalties and fines of up to $50,000 per violation and/or 1 year in jail, and civil penalties of $49,467 at the federal level, and up to $10,000 per violation at the state of California level. Well, now that we understand the definition of take, what do you do if you encounter a listed or regulated species on the project? Well, first and foremost, do not approach or touch the regulated species. If there is a designated biologist or a biological monitor on the project site, notify them immediately and they will determine the best course of action to take. If the species is in the immediate project area and is at risk of being injured or killed, stop work immediately. Notify the designated biologist or biological monitor, your supervisor, or project manager. If the designated biologist or biological monitor is not present, contact Gennaro Lockhart of Alluvion Biological Consulting at 925-989-7900. That's 925-989-7900. Again, if the species is in the immediate project area and is at risk of being injured or killed, stop work immediately. Listed and regulated species can only be handled or moved by a designated biologist or an approved biologist working under the designated biologist permit. This is very important because if you touch one of these regulated species, you will be committing take, and that carries those penalties that we just talked about. So let's say you observe or discover a listed or regulated species within the immediate project area, such as the California tiger salamander. Who can handle, touch, or remove a regulated species from the project area? As stated in item 4 above, only a designated biologist or an approved biological monitor working under the designated biologist permit is allowed to touch or move a regulated species. The designated biologist should have a valid federal 10A1A permit for that specific species in question. For listed regulated California species, the person moving or handling the species is required to have a valid scientific collection permit issued by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. If a species is regulated by both the federal government and the state of California, the person moving or handling the species would need both a valid federal 10A1A permit and a valid CDFW scientific collection permit. For you guys out there working, if you discover something, again, don't touch it, leave it alone. contact the biological monitor or the designated biologist on the site, or talk to your project supervisor, and we'll handle it from there. Let's talk about the regulated species in the project area or in and around the project area. And there are currently 9 species that occur on the project site or in the general vicinity of the project site. These are California tiger salamander, Contra Costa goldfields, Papo spikeweed, Swansons hawk, valley elderberry longhorn beetle, vernal pool fairy shrimp, vernal pool tadpole shrimp, western burrowing owl, and northwestern pond turtle. And the western pond turtle is of note because they've just recently changed the name from western to northwestern. And on the right hand side of the graphic here, and in your manuals, you'll see that there's a federal column and a California column with the rankings of each one of the species in here. And I think it's a good time to talk about what does endangered mean, what does threatened mean. I get asked that question a lot when I'm giving these presentations. Well, an endangered species is a species that is likely to go extinct, disappear completely overall or a portion of its range within the foreseeable future. Then you step down to threatened, which means that it's likely to become, that species that is threatened is likely to become endangered overall or a portion of its range in the foreseeable future. Species of special concern is usually a state ranking, and it has to do with animals that are at risk because either a precipitous decline in the species, a massive loss of habitat, or there's some issue that the agencies that regulate these species feel it's worthy of note and observation and tracking. The CNPS ranking is the California Native Plant Society, and a CNPS 1B with the 2 sub-rankings of 1 and 2. The 1B is really what's important here, and that designates that that plant species is likely to be endangered or threatened in the state of California. Also of note here is that when we go through the species profiles, which we're going to do in a minute, you'll see about halfway down the page underneath the photograph there is a status section that gives the ranking of those species and then the penalties associated with it. So pay attention to that when we go through the actual species. This slide shows the distribution of regulated species in and around the project area. And as you can see, there's quite a few in the general project vicinity. This data set comes from the California Natural Diversity Database, and a lot of these records are actually fairly recent. The California tiger salamander in purple is recent, within the last 5, 6, 7 years, as are the vernal pool fairy shrimp and vernal pool tadpole shrimp and the Contra Costa goldfields. And as you can see, it's a number of pretty good scattering of issues in the general vicinity, and this is typical of most of California because there just isn't a lot of habitat left for a lot of these species, so you end up having a lot of listed species clustered in an area. And we'll go through the 9 species that could occur on the project site, and you should be watching this video and following along in your manual. And we're going to go through the species profiles on each one of those pages that gives the life history of the species. You'll also notice the pink dashed line. This is the biological management area, and that has specific issues for you guys out there in terms of timing and working. And this represents the area where most of the wetland habitat is, where a lot of these sensitive species occur. So, and we'll be talking more about that later on in the program. The first species we're going to talk about today is the California tiger salamander. As you can see at the top of the page, it is listed both federally and by the state of California as threatened. Please notice the status and legal protection section under each species in the manual. This is where you will find the status of the species and penalties for unauthorized take, which we have already talked about. If any of you have worked in other portions of California that had California tiger salamander on a project and had gone through one of these programs, the status may have been different. The Central California population of California tiger salamander is listed as threatened, and in other parts of the state, the status is different. Of the 9 species we will go over today, this is the one you have the greatest chance of running into besides Swansons Hawk. The last half or more of the project area along Vanden Road from the old railroad grade to just south of Cannon Road is considered upland habitat of California tiger salamander. and there were California tiger salamanders observed in those ponds to the north of the project site and just to the south on the other side of the railroad tracks. This species relies on wetland habitats for breeding. They emerge from their burrows when the winter rains start, and they head for their breeding ponds. They're not very fast, but they can travel up to a mile. This species breeds from late November and continues through the spring. They will stay in the breeding ponds for up to 2 months. The female can lay up to 1,300 eggs, and the young hatch in 10 to 14 days, and then metamorphose in 60 to 94 days from the larval stage to subadults, and then they leave the breeding ponds. When things start drying up and getting warm, they return to the old burrows or will find new ones to ride out the heat of summer. This is a pretty obvious species to recognize, as you can see by the photograph. Once you've seen one, you'll know it when you see it again. And they can grow up to 8 inches or so as adults. They feed on worms, insect larvae, algae, small crustaceans, and then they can feed on frogs and small toads, and even baby mice as adults. At the bottom of each species profile page, you will see species-specific mitigation measures and a page reference. The specific mitigation measures for California tiger salamander are on page 17. I'm not going to go over all those because of the length of today's program. Your biggest takeaway from all of this should be that when you're working in the biological management area, that area marked by the pink dashed line, you will have work restrictions and you can't start work until May 1st, and the work has to be completed by October 31st or the beginning of the raining season, whichever comes first. Also, because the area encompasses all of the upland habitat for California tiger salamander within the project area, you will need to install a one-way fence, so if there are any salamanders within the immediate project footprint, they can escape on their own. So read through the measures. They are highlighted in blue, and the header is at the top of the manual. The next species is Contra Costa goldenfields, and as you can see on the top here, it is federally listed as endangered and also carries the CNPS ranking of 1B1. And again, the 1B stands for plants that are either considered threatened or endangered in California or elsewhere. As you can see, it's a bright yellow flowered plant, low growing, typically 4 to 12 inches tall, and is found almost exclusively in low wet areas and seasonal wetlands like those in and adjacent to the project area. If you look back at the map on page 4, you can see that it occurs in several locations in and around the general project area, and in some cases very large populations out there. It blooms in the spring, so you should be able to see this plant very easily if it is on or around the project site. As with most of the sensitive species on this project, it is tied to wetlands or seasonally wet areas like vernal pools, and it's why there are environmental sensitive areas identified within the project footprint, and that will need to be fenced and protected, and we'll talk about that a little bit more under another heading here in a few minutes. Again, if you look at the species profile page on page 6 in your manual, beneath the picture on the right side of the page under the status and legal protection heading, you'll see it is listed as federally endangered with the associated penalties for unauthorized take. It is endangered because of habitat loss from urban development, flood control projects, and agriculture. This is the Papo spikeweed. Again, as you can see at the top, it's listed as a CNPS 1B with no federal listing. The CNPS 1B ranking again refers to plants that are either considered threatened or endangered in California or elsewhere. This is a yellow flowered plant. It's hairy and coarse. It looks a little bit like the yellow starthistle. Doesn't have the big spines on it. The inflorescence or the flower is different, so hopefully you guys don't confuse those two. I don't think you'll ever see this on the project site, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The term papos refers to the bristles and hairs on the plant, or the types of bristles and hairs is a scientific term. This plant is found in grasslands, ditch lines, at the margins of seeps and coastal wetlands. It prefers wetter areas, but can also be found on drier sites. There's some large populations to the west of the project area and a couple of smaller ones just west of Peabody Road. Some of you may be wondering why we're talking about plants that don't seemingly occur in the immediate project area, and that's a good question. It's because the records for these observations aren't always recent, and the plants can seed in, wildlife can move into an area from other areas, so the regulatory agencies request that we evaluate everything within a 5-mile radius. This plant is listed as, again, a CNPS 1B because of habitat loss from urban development, flood control actions, highway and utility projects, and also agriculture. Species-specific mitigation measures are found on page 19. I won't be going to detail on these species-specific mitigation measures. They are spelled out in detail in the manual, which you should have on you at all times or have in the general within reach in the project. And you should be familiar with the requirements for each species or group of species. And as always, you guys and your company are wholly responsible for following and adhering to the terms and conditions of the project permits. The Swansons Hawk is listed as threatened in California, and although it has no federal listing status, it is protected under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act. There is a nest location documented in 2011 just south of Cannon Road and north of the project terminus. This nest is 150 to 200 feet inside the protective radius established for Swanson's Hawk, which is 1,320 feet or a quarter mile from an active nest. If this nest becomes active during construction, construction activities will need to halt at this location until the young have fledged and left the nest. Recent pre-construction surveys did not observe an active nest at this location, but nesting will not start until March. It's a little early, so the biological monitor on the project will need to evaluate this location for activity and nesting. Swanson's hawks are medium to large size raptors, with the adults being about 21 inches in height, and they have a 52-inch wingspan. The underside of these birds is very distinctive when soaring. There's a dark set of flight feathers on the back and tips of the wings, and that contrasts directly with the white belly and the white underlinings of the wings, as you can see on that bird on the left. And although this is typical coloration for the bird, there are also dark phases, and they can be black or mottled or very dark brown, as evidenced by the bird on the right-hand side of the screen. Breeding starts in March, and the females will lay 2 to 3 eggs. These birds nest throughout Solano County. The young will hatch out in about 28 to 30 days and typically fledge in 30 to 40 days, and then the hawks will begin to hunt in groups. They feed on rodents, lizards, snakes, frogs, birds, and insects, particularly grasshoppers. In August through September, they begin their migration south to Mexico and Argentina, and occasionally they will overwinter in Central California. It is listed as threatened due to habitat loss, particularly nesting habitat. Species-specific mitigation measures for Swanson's hawk are found on page 19. Please review them. The Valley Elderberry Longhorn beetle is a small, bright red beetle about an inch in length with long antennae. It is a wood-boring insect. It was listed in 1980 as threatened. Its life cycle is completely tied to elderberry plants as a food source and host plant. Elderberry plants are typically associated with wetter sites and riparian corridors. The male and female beetles emerge coinciding with the bloom of the elderberry plants to breed. The females lay eggs in mid-March to early June on the crevices and cracks of the bark, and about 10 days later the larvae emerge and bore into the pith of the large stems and roots of the plant to mature. They may remain inside the plant for up to 2 years. There were no elderberry shrubs or bushes observed within or near the construction footprint, but as I had explained earlier, we were required to evaluate species within a 5-mile radius of the project. The closest record is from 2002 due west, just under 5 miles from the project area. This beetle was listed as threatened due to habitat loss, riparian vegetation removal, water diversions, and pesticides. Species-specific mitigation measures for the Valley Elderberry Longhorn beetle are found on page 19. Please review them. The vernal pool fairy shrimp is a tiny crustacean up to an inch long. As their name suggests, they look like tiny shrimp. It is listed as a federally threatened species but carries no California ranking. They're found throughout the Central Valley in California in appropriate habitat and are also found in isolated populations in the southern part of the state in Riverside County. Both the vernal pool fairy shrimp and the vernal pool tadpole shrimp, which we'll be talking about next, are within the project footprint. The species only occurs in vernal pools or other seasonal wetlands, and that's an important point because as a part of this project there will be fencing around environmentally sensitive areas, which are specifically those seasonal wetlands. They are active and breeding from early December through early May. The female drops her eggs at the bottom of the pool or the eggs remain in a sac until she dies and they sink to the bottom. The eggs are amazingly resilient. They can withstand heat, cold, and prolonged desiccation. The eggs will hatch during the next wet period, but some will remain viable and not hatch for several years. Adult fairy shrimp live through a single annual cycle, meaning the adults die at the end of the season, and the population is really reliant on the hatching of those eggs. The species was listed as threatened in 1994 due to habitat loss from urbanization, agriculture, flood control actions, highway and utility projects. Species-specific mitigation measures for vernal pool fairy shrimp are found on page 18. Again, both the vernal pool fairy shrimp and vernal pool tadpole shrimp are found on the project site, and these areas are protected with ESA fencing. The vernal pool tadpole shrimp is also a tiny crustacean and grows up to 2 inches long. These shrimp look more like tiny horseshoe crabs with a large carapace or shield covering its back, as you can see on the photograph. It is listed as federally endangered, but also carries no California ranking. They're also found throughout the Central Valley of California in appropriate habitat and also in isolated populations around California. Both the vernal pool fairy shrimp and the vernal pool tadpole shrimp are within the project footprint, as I've already mentioned. Again, the species only occurs in vernal pools or seasonal wetlands, and again, that's very important because these areas will be fenced. They are active in breeding during the same period as the vernal pool fairy shrimp in December and through May. The same method of breeding and egg laying, and the eggs are also very resistant and resilient to heat and cold and prolonged desiccation. And they will also hatch during the next wet period, and some remain viable for many years. The species was listed as endangered in 1994 due to habitat loss, again from urbanization, agriculture, flood control actions, highway and utility projects. Species-specific mitigation measures for vernal pool tadpole shrimp are found on page 18. And again, both of these species, the vernal pool fairy shrimp and the vernal pool tadpole shrimp, are within the project footprint and will require ESA fencing. The western burrowing owl is a small, mottled brown and white ground-dwelling owl. They stand up to 10 inches tall, and they live in burrows created by other animals, particularly California ground squirrels, but at times or when necessary will dig their own burrows. People living and working in the Central Valley of California, or in particular the Imperial Valley in the southern part of the state, see these owls regularly. I would guess many of you have seen them perching along roads or on fence posts or mounds along bare ditch lines. They prefer habitats where they can perch and have an unobstructed view, which is why you often see them where there is low grass or the vegetation has been removed, such as agricultural fields. They start breeding in February and can continue to breed and produce clutches through August and early September. The female will typically lay 5 to 6 eggs, and the young hatch out in 21 to 28 days. They are fully fledged at 40 to 45 days, but will remain with their parents for several weeks. They feed almost exclusively on insects, but will also take small rodents, lizards, and birds. They are found throughout the state in agricultural fields and construction sites at times, and pastures as well as the deserts. The western burrowing owl is listed as a species of concern by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of California. They are also protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act since the owl is semi-migratory. Their numbers are under threat from urbanization, agriculture, flood control activities, highway, and utility projects. For this project, the protective radius for an active owl nest or burrowing owl nest is 250 feet. Recent pre-construction surveys indicated there are no burrowing owls currently in the immediate project area, but it is, again, a little bit early, and the owls could move in and use ground squirrel burrows as the breeding season approaches. Species-specific mitigation measures are listed on page 19 of your manual. The Northwestern pond turtle is a medium-sized aquatic turtle with a dark green or brown shell. We say aquatic because not all turtles are aquatic, and I don't mean tortoises here. There are several terrestrial turtles that don't spend a lot of time in the water. Northwestern pond turtles, as their name implies, live in ponds, slackwater streams, and irrigation ditches. Northwestern pond turtles are known to occur in the project vicinity. The closest record of a northwestern pond turtle is from 2008 and is about 1 mile southeast of the project area. Northwestern pond turtles are active from February through November and are dormant from December through late January, where they bury themselves in loose soil until it warms up. Breeding occurs in April and May. The females will lay 2 to 11 eggs in a shallow nest in hard pan soils along the edges of the ponds or streams where they're living. Sometimes they have 2 clutches of eggs. Females do not become sexually mature until 8 to 10 years of age. The young do not hatch until the next winter after the eggs are laid, and this long period of incubation puts them at risk. Northwestern pond turtles eat aquatic plants, insects, invertebrates, worms, salamander eggs, which of course could come into conflict with the California tiger salamander, and sometimes frogs and small fish. Northwestern pond turtles are listed as California species of special concern. Threats to the species include habitat loss from urbanization, agriculture, flood control activities, highway and utility projects, as well as competition from non-native turtles and human collection for pets. Species-specific mitigation measures for the northwestern pond turtle are found on page 19 of your manual. Let's talk a little bit about protective radius. The protective radius is an important issue for you guys because it affects how you do your work. The protective radius was a concept developed by the regulatory agencies to minimize the chance of unauthorized take of regulated species on a project. The table shown here and on page 14 of your manual shows the respective distances for species encountered on the project site. In general, with the exception of nesting birds such as the Swansons Hawk and Burrowing Owl and other nesting raptors, the protective radius is 100 feet. If you discover a regulated species or you see something you think might be a regulated species, stop work immediately and contact the biological monitor and the project engineer and or your supervisor. The biologist will make a final determination on the identity of the species, and the project engineer will let you know when to resume work. Now let's go over the BMA, or Biological Management Area. This area is demarcated on the map here and on page 21 of your manual as the dashed pink line. This is the area that encompasses all of the wetland habitat within the project area and where there is a high potential for California tiger salamander, vernal pool fairy shrimp, and vernal pool tadpole shrimp. Work period limits are in effect for this area. Groundbreaking actions and using equipment in this area cannot start until May 1 and must be completed by October 31st or the beginning of the rainy season, whichever comes first. All species protection measures identified in the Natural Resources Protection Plan, or NRPP, will be implemented throughout the BMA. Now, as I've been going through the species profiles, I've been talking about the species-specific mitigation measures for the project and referencing page numbers in the manual where those measures can be found. Please go over them and familiarize yourself with them so you remain compliant with the terms and conditions of the project. But let's go through the general mitigation measures, because many of these relate or overlap to the species-specific mitigation measures. We've tried to group these into common activities or actions for clarity and brevity. I'll be paraphrasing these to move through this pretty quickly, but if you have your manual open, you should be able to follow through in their reference there. You should be confining your access to existing routes and roads, established roads, staging and parking areas, drive at or below the speed limit on hard surface roads, 15 miles an hour or less on unpaved roads and secondary roads. Any off-road travel by vehicles or construction equipment and any ground disturbing activities should be restricted to the designated construction area. And you should confine all project-related parking, storage areas, lay-down sites, equipment storage, and any other surface disturbing activities to the project area, using to the extent possible previously disturbed areas. Work area, construction limits, fencing, and staking. Minimize construction footprint. Avoid ground disturbing activities outside the designated work area, which should be designated by fencing, staking, or flagging. Avoid disturbance of nesting, special status, and non-special status migratory birds and raptors. Avoid and minimize disturbance of water bodies designated with fencing and flagging or staking. Construction barrier fencing shall be installed around the construction area. Additional fencing may be installed around sensitive resources. And prior to any groundbreaking activities, the biological monitor will be notified so they can inspect the integrity of the fence. Topsoil salvage and spoil piles. Topsoil salvage may be required in specific locations. Spoil piles will be placed away from concentrated ground squirrel burrows or sensitive plants if there are any. Trash refuse and disposal. All food-related trash will be disposed of in enclosed containers and removed from the study area at least once a week during the construction period. And you guys shouldn't be feeding or otherwise attracting wildlife to the study area by leaving stuff laying around. Upon completion of covered activities, permittee will remove the project from the project area and properly dispose of all temporary fill and construction refuse. Water use and dust control. Implement dust control measures and minimize the use of water and don't allow puddles to form. And the reason for that is obviously those water-related species like California tiger salamander or the fairy shrimp could become a problem. Invasive weeds. It is important to control and prevent the spread of invasive weeds. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that starting on page 23 in your manual in a minute or two. If you see a plant that you think might be a weed, notify one of us out there and we'll determine if it is a weed and something we should be concerned about, and we'll deal with it. Cross-contamination prevention. Wash equipment at a paved facility away from environmentally sensitive areas prior to entering the work area. And implement best management practices to protect water quality. Erosion control. Erosion control materials potentially harmful to wildlife, such as monofilament netting, erosion control netting, or similar material is not allowed on the project. All erosion and sediment control measures must be installed prior to earth-moving activities. Spills and hazardous waste, well, this is pretty obvious for anybody that's worked on a project for any amount of time. Clean it up immediately, stop the work, dispose of it, and clean it up in a safe manner. And then you guys are probably going to have to dispose of that stuff off-site, particularly if it's hazardous. Reporting. Any worker who encounters damaged vegetation or causes harm to a special status plant or wildlife species should immediately report the incident to the designated biologist or biological monitor. And agency access, and this is important for you guys to understand. Any representative agency will have access to the site if they wish to inspect. And that could be Cal Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps, Regional Water Control Board personnel. And so at any time, these people can show up. I've been on a lot of projects over the years, and they do show up. So it's something to bear in mind. Now, you guys have heard me refer to environmentally sensitive areas several times during the presentation. There are 6 seasonal drainages or wetlands that will be impacted by this project and are considered environmentally sensitive areas. 5 of those are within the biological management area, which is pretty much designed to protect California tiger salamander and the 2 species of fairy shrimp. There's 1 drainage outside down by the train station down there, and not only do they want it protected just for species habitat, but for form and function of the drainages themselves. So working in the environmentally sensitive areas, there are conditions for that, and one of them is the seasonal work restriction. And you guys can't start work until May 1st, and you need to conclude it by October 31st or the start of the wet season, whichever comes first, and that could be a week or 2, one way or the other. But that period is deemed the dry season. You have a daily work window, and you can't start work until 30 minutes after sunrise, and you have to complete work 30 minutes before sunset. Again, if you see, and you've heard me refer to this over and over again, any special status species or regulated species show up on the project site, you should stop work immediately and notify one of us, the biological monitor out there, your project supervisor, the project engineer, and we'll contact California Division of Wildlife and or Fish and Wildlife Service and deal with that issue. If you do see something, stop work, let it. If the animal is moving out of the project area, you're going to have to put up a one-way fence for California tiger salamander anyway, so let it remove itself from the project area. Once it's beyond 100 feet, you guys are good to go. Continue working. No equipment shall be operated in wetted portions of the stream or wetlands areas at any time. That's an obvious condition. And then general BMPs that are anticipated to be utilized that include silt fence and temporary fence around all environmentally sensitive areas that are to be avoided. Any vehicle or piece of construction equipment parked for more than 15 minutes, you guys need to inspect it and look underneath the vehicle to make sure there's no special status species, regulated species that have gone underneath there to rest or to seek shade. Specifically, that would be California tiger salamander and Northwestern pond turtle. Employ erosion control measures throughout all phases of operation to keep sediment from running into any of the water bodies, and remove all debris from the high water mark and before inundation by water, and they should be disposed of through appropriate local and state ordinances. And summarizing this last section here, staging and storage areas for equipment, materials, fuels, lubricants, building materials, construction equipment, stockpiles of soils, spoils of any type. Keep that away from anywhere that it can wash back into or create a mess in one of the wetland or stream areas. And no dumping of litter or construction debris within the stream. I mean, this is all pretty obvious stuff. And lastly, pick up all debris and waste daily. SWIP stands for Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. These are general measures. You guys have had a formal project-specific SWIP plan written for you. I suggest you familiarize yourself with that. A lot of this is a rehash of what we just went over. Again, storing or letting anything go into storm drains or wetland systems or stream systems should be prohibited, and employ the specific BMPs. I'm not going to go through every one of these. You can read through them. But again, you guys have had a specific stormwater pollution prevention plan actually crafted for this project. So please review it, be familiar with it, and keep it on site. Invasive and noxious weeds. This is the last section before we wrap this up. And weeds are becoming a problem throughout the United States, and in particularly the western states, and even more particularly California, because of it's heavily roaded. It's got a great interstate system. You got tremendous agricultural production here and grazing, and you got really fertile soils. And as a result of all those factors, you have a tremendous weed influx in the state, and it is really kind of weed central in many ways. And these weeds are damaging to native habitats and populations that will infest waterways, destroy nesting and breeding habitat for wildlife, and degrade forage for livestock and wildlife. And because it becomes such a problem, the state of California has created the California Invasive Plant Council, or CAL-IPC, and they maintain a list of the most egregious species and problematic species, and they've listed them as or rated them as high, moderate, or limited based on a bunch of criteria. And those are listed on the next page. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I will go through each one of the pages, like 8 of them here. I've got 2 weeds per page. And if you see anything that looks like any of those plants, or even a reasonable facsimile of one of those, call us over and we'll make a determination. But it's important that we don't spread or move this stuff around any more than it already is. So if you see something that looks like any one of these plants, call over the biological monitor and we'll deal with it. So these are the CAL-IPC ratings. High, these species have severe ecological impacts on physical processes and plant and animal communities and vegetation structure. Moderate, these species have substantial and apparent but generally not severe ecological impacts on physical processes, plant and animal communities and vegetation structure. And limited, these species are invasive, but their ecological impacts are minor on a statewide level, where there's just not enough information to justify a higher score. Okay, so weeds occurring on and around the general project area. These species have been seen either on the project site, adjacent to the project site, or in the general project vicinity. Giant reed, which is a very large plant. It can grow up to almost 20 feet tall. It has a CAL-IPC rating of high. Billardia, which is looks a lot like a snapdragon. It is in fact the same family. Has a CAL-IPC rating of limited. Here we have black mustard, which is very common. You see this along almost every roadside in California. It's virtually everywhere. And then Italian thistle, one of many thistles that some of which are native and actually beneficial, and a lot of them like this are not beneficial. Bull thistle, and there's probably 10 or 12 thistles that occur in the state that are considered invasive or noxious in some capacity. This is field bindweed, which does not have a CAL-IPC rating, but it was seen on the project site, and it is sort of an invasive species, so we listed it here. And then Bermuda grass, which is rated as moderate, and everybody knows what Bermuda grass is. It grows in a lot of people's lawns, but it is an invasive, and it chokes out a lot of areas. Here we have the yellow star thistle and bull thistle. I bet most of you have seen yellow star thistle. It occurs it's widespread throughout the valley and surrounding foothills. It's a spiny, yellow-flowered plant. It obviously has a high rating, the CAL-IPC, and a lot of people are worried about the spread of this plant. Then bull thistle isn't as widespread in numbers, but it does cover a lot of ground, and it's rated as moderate. This is blue gum. and or eucalyptus, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. Most people in the state of California are familiar with it. A lot of people have it planted in their lawns. It's odd that it's listed as a weed species because it was actively planted, I think, from the late 1800s, early 1900s forward for windbreaks and erosion control in places where other trees just wouldn't grow. And then fig, you're seeing more and more agricultural species that have escaped being listed as weed problems, and it's not a big problem here. It's listed as a moderate. This is sweet fennel, and here again you have a, it gets a semi-agricultural, whether this escaped from people's gardens and home gardens or a true commercial agricultural operation, I'm not sure. But it has colonized a lot of areas. Grows in a range of habitats. It's very easy to grow, and so it has a Cal IPC ranking of high because it is so adaptable. And then tall whitetop is also a very nasty invasive species and can really take over wet areas, but also extends into dry areas and chokes out native vegetation. Here we have Hyssop Loosestrife and Harding grass. The Hyssop Loosestrife is more attuned to occurring in wetland habitats, so that would be of a concern in the wetter areas that happens to colonize and choke out native vegetation. And the same with the Harding grass, although that has a tendency to, it can exist in both wet and dry conditions, and you find it along coastal areas, but also up into the foothills. Well, last but not least, we have Himalayan Blackberry and Medusa head. Both are rated as high by the Cal IPC because they're very invasive and they grow in a lot of different areas. The Himalayan Blackberry on the left here, I took this picture. That plant is over 13 feet tall. And a lot of people like the plant to have it around because they harvest the berries and make jam out of it, but it does colonize very easily, particularly in wetland areas, and it can create a huge mess. It creates some habitat, but it chokes out a lot of other vegetation. On the right, the Medusa head is a nasty invasive grass that once it's dry, you can see it there. It's this highly flammable tinder, and you can spark a wildfire in that incredibly easy, and not to mention the fact that it chokes out all the native grasses from an area. Now, this concludes the weeds occurring on and around the project area, but there are another 5 or 6 pages of weeds that have the potential to occur around in the area, in the project area. Take a look at those. We're not going to go through those because they don't occur here or are not known to occur here right now, but they easily could because, as I said before, California is sort of weed central, and anything can show up at any time. So if you see anything that looks like any one of those, please notify us, and we'll take it from there. Well, we're ready to wrap this up, and I appreciate your attention. This was a little bit more lengthy than a lot of the ones we give, but there were a lot of terms and conditions and quite a few species on this one. So the important takeaways: don't touch or approach any regulated species. If you see one, notify the biological monitor. You got to stop construction when you see one. Stay within the designated construction zone. Remember the work limitations in the BMA. You guys only get to work during the dry season, which is designated as May 1st to October 31st, or the start of the rainy season or wet season, which could slide 1 or 2 weeks one way or the other. Daily work limitations from 30 minutes after sunrise to 30 minutes before sunset. Keep all equipment, materials, and debris out of the water bodies. Stay outside the fenced DSAs. That's very important. Notify the biological monitor if you see noxious or invasive weeds. Take care not to spread seeds or plant material. And if you're not sure, just come over and ask. We'll take care of it. Report all incidents to the biological monitor and your supervisor. And last and most importantly, you and your company are wholly responsible for following the measures stated in the plaques, the NRPP, which is the distillation of all those plaques. And you really got to pay attention to it because, as I said before, this is open to inspection from any one of the agencies, regulatory agencies, and I've been doing this for over 30 years, and they do show up on the site. So pay attention, be smart about how you do this stuff, and be safe. Again, thanks for listening and paying attention. And as we close out all of these presentations, be smart, Be safe. Be aware. Thank you.